It's a simple concept. You move, you punch. You quite literally beat 'em up. Unlike the one-on-one fighting games that exploded in popularity with the release of Street Fighter 2, these games pitted you and a friend against the world, taking on hordes of enemies as you traverse through rough neighborhoods, mean streets, and scenes of urban decay. With the ascent of 3D games during the 5th generation, the genre saw a decline in popularity, but in the late 80s and early 90s, it was a mainstay in arcades across the world, with subsequent home console versions regularly appearing at the top of bestseller charts. The genre began in 1984 with the release of Kung Fu Master, perhaps better known from its NES port Kung Fu, but it wasn't until the release of Double Dragon in 1987 that the conventions of the genre became solidified. Taking the basic feel of Kung Fu alongside the belt scrolling of their previous title Renegade, Technos Japan introduced continuous scrolling, the ability to use an enemy's weapon, and most importantly a two-player cooperative mode in their new game, ushering in something of a golden age for the fledgling genre. Final Fight, Golden Axe, River City Ransom, Battletoads, even licensed titles like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and The Simpsons, these games all saw critical and commercial success around this time. But one title stood out amongst the competition, a sequel that not only perfected the formula of its predecessor, but also emerged as the definitive take on a genre flooded with imitators, imbuing its tropes with a fresh look and feel, all accompanied by one of the best soundtracks ever to grace a 16-bit system. Evilhood once again cast its shadow over the city. For a game like this, was that such a bad thing? Streets of Rage 2 was developed by Sega and released in 1992 as a sequel to, well, Streets of Rage. Yeah, funnily enough, started out as a sequel to Golden Axe, they were way off. Anyway, while the first game had been a success, with Electronic Gaming Monthly even calling it the greatest fighting game of all time, the arrival of a sequel only a year later made such statements short-lived. It's not like the first Streets of Rage is a bad game, it's enjoyable, but Streets of Rage 2 is the kind of sequel that makes the first game feel almost irrelevant, at least to modern players. The most obvious difference is how the newer game looks, and yeah, it's stunning. The images just pop right out of the screen with dazzling colours, detailed sprites, and backgrounds bursting with light and shade. I always thought that the first game looked a bit flat, with a murky texture that never stood out against the competition. It's a decent looking game for the era in which it was made, but the second game has a style that you would actively want to emulate today. The sequel also controls better, with more fluid animation that makes your movements feel less choppy. It's not as smooth as, say, Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo, but I don't mind the balance here. Your movements feel snappy and quick without ever coming across as disjointed. Speaking of gameplay, the special moves have been altered, with the police car attack being replaced with an attack that you perform yourself. It can be used multiple times, but takes a small percentage of your health every time it hits. Also, and this is just me, but I only recently learned that the police car was in fact my special attack. It's triggered by the A button on the Mega Drive controller, which is naturally the first button I press when starting the game to remind myself of the controls, so I just assumed that this attack was a cutscene that was just triggered every time you started the game. Even after realising that the police car was in fact a special move, I always held it in reserve, scared to use it in case a greater need presented itself later in the stage. As such, it would often remain unused, at least until I knew the levels well enough to know when they ended and who attacked you at each part. In contrast, the sequel's special attack is far more integrated into the gameplay, able to be deployed several times when challenges present themselves. It also introduces an addictive new gameplay mechanic, where the health lost from using special moves is tempered by the regular restorative items across each stage, creating a great risk-reward system where your use of special moves is restrained only by your own confidence in your abilities. It's a game optimised to near perfection, but I have to ask, why do the two players take damage from each other? If there was anything that could have been fixed from the first game, then it's this. The fact that you can accidentally hit each other results in both players having to take separate ends of the screen, with the risk of attacking your teammate dissuading you from jumping in to help them out of a tough spot. It also really winds your mate up whenever it happens, which is not the best in a stressful battle scenario. It's a flaw, in my opinion, but not one that we didn't get used to with time. It's annoying, but if that's your only problem with the game, then it must be pretty good. Following the events of the first game, Adam, Blaze and Axel meet up in their safe, clean city to reminisce about old times. The next day, Blaze receives a call from Adam's brother, Skate, telling her that Adam has been taken by their old nemesis, Mr. X. With criminals now returning to the streets, Axel and Blaze, alongside Skate and Axel's friend Max, decide to band together, setting out to rescue Adam and take back their city. It's a simple plot, but for a game like this, it's perfectly serviceable. It follows the trends of other beat-em-up games with an urban setting, criminal organisations, and a plot involving revenge and the rescuing of friends. These tropes are all tied together in a definitive package here, not as a parody or an homage, but a serious example of all the things that make these types of games so appealing to play through. It's obvious, but the feeling of taking on the entire city to save your mate using only your fists and whatever weapons you can scrounge is so satisfying. Maybe it connects to some caveman part of the brain. Just a great feeling whenever you punch a bad guy. The stage environments do well to foster this dangerous atmosphere. As mentioned, they're visually stunning, but they're designed well too. It's the little details that help make the city feel lived in, like the torn posters on the walls, the potholes in the road, or the enemies sleeping on the benches in the park. My favourite is in Stage 3, which features a bar decked out with bare-knuckle arcade cabinets. This was the original title of the Streets of Rage games in Japan, and the cabinets leave money when you destroy them, like you're taking the money that the players would have spent playing the game, and I just think that's pretty cool. I won't pretend that this game has a deep or particularly meaningful narrative, but that's not the point of this kind of story. It offers an incentive to keep fighting, which is hardly needed anyway, thanks to the addictive gameplay, gorgeous visuals and tight controls, whilst cultivating an environment that makes each punch feel weighty and important. What can I say? It just feels good when you hit people. You'll notice that on the title screen only one credit is given, and it's to Yuzo Koshiro for the music. This is no accident, as his score for the game is nothing short of a masterpiece, and one of the best examples of a video game soundtrack in the 16-bit era, or indeed any era. I'm not really sure about copyright rules on this music, so I'll leave a link in the description for anyone interested, but if you've played the game then you'll know how impressive this music is, even 30 years later. Koshiro, with occasional help from Motohiro Kawashima, created songs influenced by contemporary house, techno and trance music, and he was incredibly successful in doing so. The music gained a life outside of its original game, perhaps one of the first soundtracks to do so, with their CD releases becoming big sellers in Japan, whilst Koshiro himself was apparently invited to nightclubs to DJ and play his work. Koshiro felt that the most important part of the electronic music he wanted to emulate was the drums, in particular the percussive sounds of the Roland TR-909. The instrument was hugely influential in the development of house music, and Koshiro attempted to replicate its kick, snare, hi-hat, and conga sounds for the game. He also simulated the synth sounds found in contemporary club music, such as those of the Roland TB-303, and in the liner notes of the Streets of Rage soundtrack, he mentioned that this was a difficult part of the development process, as the analog synth sounds had to be recreated on the Mega Drive's Yamaha YM2612 sound chip, which was a digital FM synthesizer. He also made use of techniques such as panning to help keep the music moving forward, creatively working around the limitations of the Mega Drive's audio hardware. This work paid off though. I can't imagine a more fitting soundtrack to a dingy, shadowy, neon-lit city. It's the perfect accompaniment to such dangerous nightlife, and a great set of songs in their own right. In the mid-2000s, the beat-em-up genre saw something of a spiritual successor, with hack-and-slash games like Heavenly Sword and the Dynasty Warriors series emulating the same addictive gameplay, only this time in a 3D environment. Traditional beat-em-ups saw a revival not long after, with notable releases such as Castle Crashers, Fable Heroes and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, not to mention the successful reboots of classic franchises like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Shredder's Revenge and of course Streets of Rage 4. These games saw success and critical acclaim, but they're clearly an homage to a bygone era, an exercise in style parody that doesn't necessarily elevate the genre to a new level. They wear their influences proudly and are happy to offer simple, fun experiences, but can't help feeling like throwbacks in today's gaming landscape. I get that that's the point, and yeah, a well-made, nostalgic game can be a joy to play. Just look at Sonic Mania. But Streets of Rage 2 is an example of a genre at its height, the kind of game that defines an era in the minds of players and stands as the point of reference for those attempting to recreate such an experience. It wasn't the first of its kind, but it took the games that had come before and refined their disparate conventions into one conclusive title. It set a new benchmark for what video game music could and should be, and remains a high point of its genre, console, and generation. I guess there's not much else to say. It just feels good when you hit me. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to like it, comment your thoughts down below, and maybe subscribe to see more content like this. If you're a fan of the retro games, then you might enjoy a video I just did about Ninja Gaiden on the NES. Just a little recommendation there, you can have that for free. I also want to thank my Streets of Rage companion for helping me get this footage. Did you have any thoughts on the game? Anything you'd like to add?
It's just a really good game, I can't lie.
Oh, nice. Thanks for not lying. Cool. And finally, most importantly, thanks for watching.